For 67 years, they were the world's most famous friends. But as Judi Dench stood at Maggie Smith's funeral, she was hiding a small, secret object in her pocket, a final promise made decades ago that she is finally ready to share with the world. When the news broke on September 27, 2024, that Dame Maggie Smith had passed away peacefully at the age of 89, the world mourned the loss of an absolute cinematic titan. Millions of fans instantly remembered her as the fiercely protective Professor McGonagall from the Harry Potter franchise, or the endlessly sharp-tongued Dowager Countess from Downton Abbey. But for Dame Judi Dench, the loss wasn't about saying goodbye to a global icon or a trending topic. It was the devastating severing of a 67-year lifeline, an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of the London stage, long before the world anointed either of them as royalty of British cinema. To truly understand the immense gravity of what Judi Dench was hiding in her pocket that day, we have to travel back in time to an era when they were just two young, hungry actresses fighting for oxygen in the exact same crowded room. The media always loved to paint them as bitter rivals. You see, the narrative was simply too perfect for the press to ignore. They were the two reigning queens of the West End, navigating a notoriously cutthroat industry that famously and cruelly preferred to pit ambitious women against each other. If Judi was the emotional anchor, the master of profound restraint who could break your heart with a single, devastating look in a blockbuster James Bond film or a complex Shakespearean tragedy, Maggie was the fiery, untouchable genius. Maggie was the one who could slice through a scene with a microscopic, razor-sharp inflection of her voice, leaving audiences and even her fellow veteran actors utterly terrified of her power. They were two sides of the same theatrical coin, constantly competing for the same prestigious BAFTA nominations, the same Academy Awards, and the same legendary stage roles. Yet, while the tabloids feverishly fabricated stories of intense jealousy and stolen scripts, trying desperately to build a feud worthy of Hollywood gossip columns, the actual truth of their relationship was entirely different and far more profound than anyone realized. It was a secret, ironclad alliance, built in the dusty dressing rooms of the Old Vic Theatre in 1957, that would outlast their marriages, outlive their contemporaries, and redefine the very nature of female friendship in the ruthless world of show business. Let us deeply examine the reality of this so-called rivalry, because the granular details are incredibly revealing about how these two women operated behind closed doors. When Judi Dench and Maggie Smith first crossed paths at the Old Vic, the air was thick with the smell of heavy grease paint and the relentless, suffocating pressure of a deeply patriarchal industry. They were stepping into a rigid hierarchy ruled by titans like Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud, an era where young actresses were often treated as entirely expendable. You were expected to be compliant, decorative, and endlessly grateful just to stand in the background. Instead, Judi and Maggie became undeniable forces of nature. They shared a cramped, drafty dressing room, huddling together against the damp London chill, and in that tiny, private space, they forged an unspoken pact of survival. The press, of course, demanded a war. The media ecosystem thrives on female competition. When Maggie conquered the monumental role of Desdemona opposite Olivier's terrifying Othello, the theater critics immediately looked to see how Judi would respond to the triumph. When Judi subsequently stunned the world with her devastating, raw emotional precision playing Ophelia in Hamlet, the intense spotlight aggressively pivoted right back to Maggie. But the massive secret the media completely failed to understand was that their greatest asset wasn't their manufactured competition with each other. It was their profound, almost intimidating admiration for one another. There is a famous, quiet story of a young Judi Dench lingering in the shadows of a darkened theater, long after the audience had departed, just to study Maggie Smith's flawless rhythm and timing on stage. She watched how Maggie could command the absolute silence of 1,000 breathing people with nothing but the slight, imperceptible tilt of her chin. And in return, Maggie, who was famously guarded and incredibly self-critical behind her confident facade, confessed to close friends that Judi's raw, unfiltered emotional depth was the one thing in the world that genuinely terrified her. They pushed each other to unprecedented, dizzying heights. Consider the 1985 cinematic masterpiece A Room with a View. Their on-screen chemistry wasn't just exceptional acting, it was the brilliant culmination of decades of private, shared history. They knew exactly how to provoke each other, how to support each other, and how to elevate a scene from merely good to undeniably iconic. They were playing a highly advanced, private game of emotional tennis that only they knew the rules to, entirely invisible to the directors and producers who foolishly thought they were simply capturing a standard performance. But wait, right here is where the story of their legendary, celebrated friendship takes a sharp, highly unexpected turn. What if I told you that the greatest rivalry in British theatre history was actually a beautifully orchestrated illusion? What if the real truth, the massive secret they kept hidden behind the polite smiles and the polite applause at countless glamorous award ceremonies, was actually rooted in a shared, silent, and overwhelming grief? Around the time of Maggie Smith's passing, Judi Dench made a shocking, visceral comparison, stating that the energy created by grief is exactly like petrol. It is highly combustible, entirely unpredictable, and entirely capable of burning you alive if you do not know how to meticulously channel it. And the small, peculiar object Judi held so tightly in her coat pocket at Maggie's funeral is the ultimate, heartbreaking proof of exactly how they fueled each other through the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of their long lives. To fully grasp the deeply counterintuitive nature of their bond, we must look at how they navigated the brutally unforgiving landscape of aging in modern cinema. In an industry that systematically discards women the very moment they show signs of growing older, Judi and Maggie chose a deeply radical path. They flatly refused to leave. And they did it together, standing shoulder to shoulder. By the time they starred in the 2004 film Ladies in Lavender, they were entirely rewriting the rules of the global box office. But behind the scenes, their dynamic was razor-sharp, brilliant, and completely unsentimental. During the filming of a complex scene where they are rushing up a narrow staircase, Judi instinctively tried to get ahead to find her camera mark, and Maggie, without missing a single beat, loudly ad-libbed, telling Judi to stop pushing her. The director, completely captivated by the moment, kept it in the final cut of the film because it was so utterly, perfectly authentic. This wasn't just a funny behind-the-scenes blooper. It was a microscopic, brilliant glimpse into the mechanical genius of their survival. They weaponized their humor as armor. In the incredible 2018 documentary directed by Roger Mitchell, famously known as Tea with the Dames, the sheer, breathtaking savagery of their wit was on full display for the entire world to witness. The documentary gathered Judi Dench, Maggie Smith, Joan Plowright, and Eileen Atkins at a bucolic country estate to simply talk about their extraordinary lives. When Judi humbly remarked to the camera that they would all go on working forever if they were simply asked by directors, Maggie immediately shot back with lethal precision, pointing out that Judi is always asked first. It was a hilarious, viral moment that delighted millions of fans across the internet, but it also masked a profound, melancholic truth. Maggie could be notoriously intimidating, a woman who did not suffer fools gladly and demanded excellence from everyone in her orbit. Acclaimed stage and screen actors like Sir Derek Jacobi openly admitted to being terrified of her immense, towering talent. But Judi was the one person in the room who was never afraid of those sharp edges. Judi was her anchor in a tempestuous sea. When the world constantly demanded they be demure, elderly national treasures, they sat together, drinking champagne, cursing like sailors, and complaining about the physical decay of aging with a fierce, unapologetic honesty that most people would find shocking. They protected each other from the crushing isolation that inevitably accompanies extreme fame, becoming a two-woman fortress against the fading of the light. This brings us to the profound technicalities of their shared existence and the deeply private, almost mystical way Judi Dench handles the inescapable reality of loss. Dame Judi has always possessed a remarkably unique, deeply personal tradition for honoring her dearly departed friends. Tucked away in her expansive, incredibly serene garden at her home in Surrey, she has meticulously cultivated what is essentially a private, living forest of memories. She doesn't just attend standard funerals, send generic floral arrangements, or write polite letters of condolence. She physically plants trees in the earth. She has built a majestic, sprawling memorial woodland filled with individual, carefully chosen saplings dedicated to the titans of the stage and screen who have left this world behind. There are towering trees for Alan Rickman, for the brilliantly talented Helen McCrory, for the legendary Diana Rigg, and a deeply special one for her own beloved late husband, the actor Michael Williams. It is a quiet, monumental act of defiance against the cruelty of forgetting. It is a profoundly beautiful way to ensure that the people who profoundly shaped her life continue to grow, continue to change with the changing of the seasons, and continue to cast a protective shadow on the physical world. When Maggie Smith's health began to decline, the inevitable, crushing weight of this tradition loomed large. The media was completely unaware of the deeply spiritual connection Judi felt to this garden, a sacred place where the ghosts of the West End and Hollywood whispered through the leaves. When Maggie finally passed away, bringing a definitive end to an era of absolute theatrical perfection, Judi went into her garden to plant a tree in her honor. She specifically chose a crabapple tree. The crabapple is a flawlessly fitting metaphor for Maggie Smith herself, beautiful, deeply rooted in British soil, fiercely enduring, and carrying a fruit that is famously sharp, tart, and biting, yet highly prized by anyone who knows its true worth. It was a private ceremony of grief, a solitary moment for Judi to say a final goodbye to the remarkable woman who had shared her dressing room, her deepest fears, and her greatest triumphs for nearly 7 decades. But the universe, or perhaps the sheer, indomitable spirit of Maggie Smith herself, had one final, breathtaking script revision to offer the world. The phenomenon of their connection extended far beyond the physical realm, manifesting in a moment so perfectly timed it completely defies all logic. Let's look at the actual day of Maggie Smith's funeral in late 2024. Judi Dench was quietly preparing to face a world that was demanding her public mourning. She was dealing with that combustible, highly volatile petrol of grief she had so eloquently spoken about. Just before she left her home for the somber service, her longtime gardener, a man named Joe, approached her. He had been carefully tending to the newly planted memorial woodland that morning. He walked up to Judi and handed her something seemingly impossible. Against all botanical odds, and despite the cold season and the absolute infancy of the newly planted sapling, the crab-apple tree planted in honor of Dame Maggie Smith had produced a single, solitary fruit on the exact morning of her funeral. It was as if Maggie, with her legendary precision and impeccable comedic timing, was delivering one last, perfectly executed note from beyond the curtain. It was a tangible, miraculous piece of their enduring legacy, a physical manifestation of a friendship that absolutely refused to be extinguished by something as trivial as death. And so, as the beautiful eulogies were read aloud, and the world's most powerful actors bowed their heads in profound sorrow, Dame Judi Dench stood quietly among the sea of mourners. The press cameras flashed endlessly, trying to capture the heartbreak of a legendary James Bond star losing her absolute dearest friend. But Judi wasn't just standing there entirely consumed by grief. Her hand was slipped deep into her heavy coat pocket, her fingers tightly closed around that single, tiny, perfect crabapple. It was her secret tribute, a final, silent inside joke between 2 fiercely brilliant women who had conquered the entire world together. She carried the literal fruit of their 67-year legacy, proving to herself that while the final curtain had tragically fallen on Dame Maggie Smith, the deep, unbreakable roots they planted together would continue to bear fruit forever. If you want to uncover more hidden secrets behind the absolute biggest rivalries and friendships in cinema history, you will not believe the dark, twisted truth behind the making of The Wizard of Oz. Click the video on your screen right now to find out exactly what the Hollywood studios tried to bury forever, and I will see you there.